Hello, I'm Andy Clark. I'm one of the consulting authors in the Singapore math program called Math in Focus. I'd like to take a few minutes to share with you how we teach 4th and 5th graders about fractions, how we teach them to add, subtract, even multiply and divide them. Understanding fractions is critical to future success in math. Some educators even think that it's the most important concept for doing well in algebra. Too often, though, fractions are considered very hard and challenging by our students, or else they just memorize rules like ours is not to reason why, ours is but to invert and multiply. But we want students who understand what they're doing, and if students can visualize fractions and visualize what they're doing, they actually can add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions with meaning. When we first introduce fractions to students in 2nd and 3rd grade, we show them fractions in a variety of contexts. We show them in circles and bar models with rectangles. We show them even on the number line to help explain the meaning of a fraction. In fact, this is the most important model we'd like students to have. And so students get to see what the meaning of a fraction is, so that by the time students enter 4th grade, they come in understanding that a fraction is equal parts of a whole, okay? So that when students come to 4th and 5th grade, we're assuming they know that. And the model we use primarily, we've shown them a lot of other models, but the model primarily that we use is using the bar model, or a rectangle, divided into equal parts. Now, most students in 4th or 5th grade can come in, if I say this is my whole, and I want to show what a half of that is, most of them know to cut it into 2 equal parts and to show that this is a half and this is a half and 2 halves make a whole. That's not particularly hard for 4th and 5th graders. And they might even be able to do quite easily if I ask them, show me a fourth, to know that they could divide each of these halves into fourths, or just divide this into 4 equal parts, and that each of these are called fourths. Okay, that's not the hard part. What gets a little complicated in 4th and 5th grade is that I begin to ask kids to do operations with fractions. For instance, I might ask them to add 1/2 plus 1/4. And when I do that, students have to be able to visualize this picture. Because if they can visualize this picture, they can look at this and say, oh, this 1/2 is made up of 2/4. So I can add these 2/4 and this 1/4 to make 3/4. And they are learning the most important thing about adding and subtracting fractions, which is that you have to add and subtract only like things. You can't add apples and oranges unless you call them fruit. You can't subtract 2 cats from 3 dogs. You can subtract 2 cats from 5 animals. So in the same way, when you add or subtract fractions, you have to be adding or subtracting like things. So we have to turn them into something that is like, and we call that finding an equivalent fraction. So we found that 2/4 is equivalent to 1/2. So we could add 2/4 and 1/4 to make 3/4. That was a pretty easy one to visualize. Let's take a more challenging one, though. Again, we want to make sure students understand they have to add like things. We want them to try something a little harder. We ask them first to divide this bar into 3 equal parts. And each of these would be called 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And then we say, show us half the bar. They show us half the bar. And we ask them this hard question, how much is 1/2 plus 1/3? Well, this is harder. They can't make halves into thirds. They can't make thirds into halves. What am I going to do? I have to find something I can make them both into, right? And what we call that is finding the least common denominator. I want to find an equivalent fraction that I can make halves into and thirds into, so we can add them. We can't add them until they're like things. So we're going to think about this. Can we make them into fourths? Can't. Can we make them into fifths? Can't. How about sixths? Yeah, we can make them into sixths. In fact, if we cut this bar into 6 equal parts, then we can see that half of those 6, or 3 of those 6, is a half. And we can also see that 2 of the 6 are the same as 1/3. So students now say, this is kind of simple. I've got like things 6. 3/6 plus 2/6 is 5/6, exactly right. Because we have equivalent fractions, we're adding like things. So we want students who can see this, even when they don't have the luxury of having a picture, that they can see in their minds that when they add halves and thirds, that if they can add them as sixths. Can you see how the picture really helps students understand what they're doing? So there's a couple of other words in addition to equivalent fractions that students need to know. One of the things that they'll start to learn in 4th and 5th grade is the difference between what are called proper fractions and improper fractions. All a proper fraction means is it's less than 1. And all an improper fraction means is that it's more than 1. It didn't do anything wrong. It's just that, for instance, 7/8 is a proper fraction, whereas 8/7 is an improper fraction because it's more than 1. Once students have this strong visual image, they can do much more than just add and subtract. They can even begin to understand multiplication and division. For instance, if I said to you how much is 3 times 1/2, that's not really hard if you think about the meaning of that, which is 3 1/2. So the students could say, there's 1/2, 1/2, and another half. 3 times 1/2 is 1 1/2. If we had 4 times a half, it would be 2 whole, because it would be 4 halves, and so on. They can even think of this in terms of division. If I have 3 halves and I want to divide it between 3 people, they would each get 1/2. Okay? It gets harder if we have to say, what if we have 4 halves divided by 3 people? But you can see again, if students visualize what they're doing, they can understand this and not just mechanically move numbers around. So how can you help? I think there's a lot of things you can do. First of all, the most important thing you can do is just encourage a child. Even when the homework is hard, encourage them to try it, to work hard at doing the problem, and ask them to visualize, to help you think through what the picture might look like of whatever operation they're doing with fractions. Students will be coming home with some homework that looks like this, for instance. Sometimes they'll be asked to add, let's say, 3/8 plus 1/2. And then there's this piece here, and you may say, well, what is all this over here? What this is trying to get students to see is it's helping them think, I've got to turn these into like things. The eighths and the halves have to be like. Can I turn the eighths into halves? No, I can't. But I can turn the halves into eighths. And that's what this is showing a picture of. But after they've done a few of those, then we want students to be able to do it without the picture. Find the sum of 1/6 and 1/12. We want students now to begin to say, oh, this is simple. I'm just going to turn these into 12ths. 1/6 is the same as 2/12 because I have a picture of it in my mind. What can you do then to help your child? It would be very, very helpful if every time you did something that involved fractions, if you mentioned to your child that you're using fractions so that they could see how practical fractions are. For instance, when you're cooking, when you're sewing, when you're doing carpentry, in sports, in telling time even. All of them involve fractions. There are many, many of these kinds of opportunities to talk about fractions. And the more you do that, the more the child will see it's not something just in school, but something that you do at home and in life as well. The second thing is, if you're really ambitious, is you can make these fraction bars with your child so you can play games that involve adding and subtracting numbers. So for instance, you take a strip of paper, any size paper, 3 by 8 if it's possible, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to be colored, any color you like. And you just make that, call that the one hole, okay? That's the one hole. And then you take a strip of paper the same size, right? Doesn't matter color or whatever. And you then say, you cut that into 2 equal pieces so that each one of them are 1/2. Right? So now we have 2 halves, right? Then we're going to take another piece of paper, doesn't matter what color it is, but it does matter that it's exactly the same size, and we're going to cut that one into 4 equal pieces, or into 4/4. And then finally, we take another piece of paper that's exactly the same size, it doesn't have to be this big, and we cut this into 8 equal pieces. You call each of those 1/8, and you have 8 of these eighths that also make 1 whole. Now, if you've made 2 of these, you can play a game with your child. For instance, you could make a number cube, take a wooden cube, and write on one side 1/8, 3/8, 5/8, 1/4, and 1/2, or just slips of paper. You don't need a cube. You can just use slips of paper. And then you play the game, you roll the number cube, or you pick the slip of paper, and let's say it said you rolled 1/4. Then you would take 1/4 and cover your strip with 1/4. Then it would be your child's turn. Then on your next turn, say you rolled 1/2. Then you would take the 1/2, put it on here, and you would use this opportunity to ask your child how much of the strip is covered. 1/4 plus 1/2, what does that equal? 3/4. So you're practicing addition as you're playing the game. When your child gets really good at this, then you can play subtraction. You can cover the whole strip with 1/2, 1/4, and 2/8. Now you roll the cube or pick the number strip and you do whatever it says, except now you take that off. The person who wins is the person who uncovers their strip exactly first, before the other person. So say you rolled a 3/8. What are you going to do? You don't have 3/8. So you'll have to trade in the 1/4 for 2/8 and then take away 3/8. Can you see how playing a game like this can make your child really enthusiastic and get lots of practice in adding and subtracting fractions? Finally, what I'd really like to encourage you to think is the more you encourage your child to persist, even when things are challenging, the better they will do in school. The harder they work, the more they practice, the better they get. And the better they get at this, the more they will like it. And the more they like and understand operating with fractions, the more they will be successful in their math careers. Thanks very much for taking this time.